today I'm going to be talking about Armour. So let's get into it. In edgeoffate, Bungie reworked the Armour system alongside adding tiering to loot. The main things that have come from this are as follows. There is a new stat system that makes every stat point matter, alongside giving us more freedom and ability to increase our stats above 100, which grants primarily damage increases to the abilities those stats work with. For example, when going above 100 grenade stat, you will gain more grenade damage for every stat point you have above 100. The exceptions to this are mainly health and class stats, and I'll explain those soon. They also have changed how stats roll on Armour, instead of having basically completely randomized stats, they've changed it into 3 main spikes, one being randomly rolled and the remaining 2 being decided by your Armour archetype, which at the time of writing there are currently 6 of, those being Brawler, which grants health and melee, Paragon, which grants super and melee, Grenadier, which grants grenade and super, Specialist, that grants class and weapons, Bulwark, that grants health and class, and finally Gunner, which grants weapon and grenade. Something important to note with these is that the primary stat of each archetype, that being the one I said first, will always drop with a higher stat. This at tier 5 being 30 main stat, 25 secondary, and 20 tertiary, the tertiary being the completely random rolled stat. These archetypes do mean that currently certain primary and secondary stat combinations like super and weapons are at the time of writing physically impossible, something that will hopefully be fixed later down the line, maybe in Renegades. The scaling for your abilities also now works differently, so that 70 stat points is basically equivalent to the old tier 10 stats. So, having 100 grenade stat will charge grenades as fast as 100 stat beforehand, and going above 70 will give you more energy for each stat point than previously. They've also seemingly simplified a lot of the general cooldowns across the game, as well as generally lowering them. Whilst supers seem to take longer to charge across the board, but have better damage to energy conversions with higher super stats. They have also changed what almost every stat does and give them enhanced bonuses past 100 stats, as mentioned previously. The immobility stat has been converted into weapons, which grants up to a 10% reload and handling stat buff. This means that it will not scale past 100 handling or reload stat, as it is not an animation scaler, it is just a stat. Alongside this stat buff, the weapons stat also grants up to a 15% minor and major damage bonus, and when above 100 stat, it grants up to a 15% damage bonus for specials and primaries, and a 10% boss damage bonus for heavies, and the chance for ammo bricks to grant more ammo. This is about a 1 or 2 extra ammo per brick for single-shot weapons, and about 50% for multi-shot weapons, those being machine guns, trace rifles, and rocket primaries. Resilience has been converted into the health stat. The health stat effectively replaces the recuperation mod, as it grants up to 70 HP per orb of power pickup, alongside a passive 10% flinch resistance. When above 100 stat, it now grants increased HP in PvE and increased shield recharge rate. This is basically meant to be your replacement for the recovery stat. 150 health stat is equivalent to old tier 10 recov, and any higher than that means your shield will regenerate quicker than before. The main problem though is that it does not scale HP recharge rate or the internal cooldown for HP regen to start like old recovery did, meaning generally your HP will generate slower. The grenade, super and melee stats all scale the cooldown time and energy gains for your main abilities. When above 100 stat, you can gain up to 65% extra grenade damage, 45% extra super damage, and 30% extra melee damage. The reason melee stat is so low in comparison is because it is a 1.3 times multiplier, unlike every other melee damage bonus in the game, as they changed melee damage scaling to be additive instead of multiplicative like it was before. And finally, the recovery stat has been changed into the class stat, which scales the cooldown timer and energy gains for your class ability, and when enhanced, grants a up to 40 HP overshield when using your class ability. What this mainly all means is that an old build where, for example, someone had 20 mobility, 100 resolve, 50 recovery, 100 discipline, 40 intellect, and 30 strength, now would be 100 health, 30 melee, 100 grenade, 40 super, 100 class, and 20 weapons. And when adjusting for scaling equivalent stats to the old system, would be about 100 health, 20 melee, 70 grenade, 27 super, 70 class, and 20 weapons. So you can pretty easily get away with lowering the stats you don't need without much consequence, at least compared to the old system, but I wouldn't really recommend scaling your stat below 35 unless you really think you don't need it, like the health stat or class stat in PvE and the weapon stat in PvP, as generally armor has such higher stats now that you kind of just don't need to do that. The next part of the armor rework is the introduction of the tiering system. What this means is that better stats are now locked behind better tiers. For example, a tier 2 armor piece, no matter what, will always be worse statistically than a tier 3 armor piece. The specifics for that should be currently on screen. But as a guideline, tier 3 armor is equivalent to pre-Edge of Fate armor, tier 4 is better than old armor, and tier 5 is statistically the same as God rolled tier 4 armor, but will always drop with the best stats, and has stat tuning. And speaking of, each tier comes with extra benefits. Tier 4 armor grants extra mod capacity up to 11 energy, and getting tier 5 armor grants stat tuning. That lets you either grant one stat to all your non-focus stats, so getting an armor piece that spikes in grenade, melee, and super, and putting on balance tuning, as it's called, will grant 1 point to health, class, and weapons. Or you can reduce one stat by 5 points to put 5 points into a randomly rolled stat. So, if you roll grenade as the tunable stat, you can reduce your health stat to increase your grenade stat. This is why you'll see such a difference when upgrading from tier 4 to tier 5 armor, as whilst in the new tier system, both tier 4 and tier 5 armor can roll at 75 stats, the armor tuning with the correct rolls allows you to basically remove any wasted stats in your build, such as weapons in PvE or health in PvE, to put them into more important stat columns. Which is why you should make sure to upgrade any tier 4 armor into tier 5s, even though on the surface they may seem identical. The last thing added in this armor rework is armor set bonuses. If you played any gacha game or The Division or even Terraria, you'll be pretty familiar with the system, but for those of you who aren't, putting on 2 and 4 pieces of an armor set will grant you perks based on the armor set. For example, the Last Discipline Crucible set will grant you increased primary weapon reload speed when defeating opponents with primary ammo weapons, when having 2 pieces of the armor set equipped. And picking up an Orb of Power will grant special ammo progress when using 4 pieces of the armor set. You can also combine multiple 2-piece bonuses at once, so if you want Last Discipline's 2-piece, you can also use it with the Trials 2-piece that grants health when picking up ammo bricks. There is a set bonus for every armor set in the game, and I was going to make a tier list for them, but considering this is releasing days before the season ends, try to farm Bushido and Smoke Jumper / Last Discipline armor in the last day you've got, as that's really all you need right now, and there's going to be a bunch of new armor and renegades that'll seemingly provide better or on-par bonuses than currently anyway. Now that we're done with the armor rework, I'm now going to talk about mods, as they're mostly the same, but there's a couple distinct differences that have happened in Edge of Fates that are worth covering. And of course some people might just not know how the mods actually work. So firstly, there is Helmet mods. There is ability into super energy mods, which have basically been unchanged. However, unless your build relies on using abilities and getting lots of supers, I don't really recommend them in the current game. Ammo scouts are currently removed but will return in renegades, so whenever you create an ammo brick it will make it for your allies. I heavily recommend using these in Day 1 or Epic and Master content before doing damage to make sure your team has ammo. Another ammo mod to use is ammo finders, as they are amazing right now. They grant from 25 to 50% extra special ammo progress and 33 to 100% extra heavy ammo progress depending on how many you equip. And I would heavily recommend always having one on your build, as they make a major difference. And if you can fit 2 on, that's even better. Siphon mods still work the same way but are less annoying to run due to the extra mod space you now have. I always recommend running one of them unless you're running a pure ability build, as getting double kills in PvE with your primary of choice is basically guaranteed. Fun mods were changed in Edge of Fate are not actually useful now due to the new stat system. They are another reason I'd recommend running about 35 for your least important stat, as a single fun mod will grant 20 stats for having 1 armor charge, based on which armor piece you put it on. For example, helmets have the super stat. Then we have the two mods that are only actually relevant in PvP. That being targeting mods that are again more usable due to the increased mod capacity and grant 5 to 10 aim assist, a 0.9 to 0.8 cone size multiplier, and a 0.85 to 0.7 ADS time multiplier depending on how many mods you have equipped 1 second after readying the weapon. The other mod is In-Flight Compensator, that grants 15 to 30 airborne effectiveness depending on how many you have equipped. On your arms, you have melee and grenade fonts, melee and grenade kickstarts that consume armor charge to grant ability energy after using the respective ability, based on how many you have equipped and armor charges consumed. These are mainly useful in niche builds and PvP now, as you don't really need them and armor charge is just more important to have up at all times now. There are mods that, when dealing ability damage, grants ability energy for the opposite ability or class abilities. For example, Focusing Strike is a mod that grants class ability energy for dealing melee damage, and Impact Induction is a mod that grants grenade energy for dealing melee damage. They're very useful. Then there are loader mods that grant 10 to 18 reload speed and a 0.85 reload time multiplier, 0.5 seconds after readying the weapon. Dexterity mods that grant a 0.8 to 0.7 ready stow time multiplier, and it's worth noting with these that the stow time multiplier does not scale past 100 handling. There are grenade/melee kill creates a orb of power mods which grant increased super energy and lower orb cooldown based on the mods you have equipped. And finally Fastball, which increases your grenade throw velocity and range. On your chest piece, there's ammo generation mods that should basically always be used, as they grant a 20 to 50 ammo generation stats based on the amount of them equipped. Next there's Charged Up, which increases your max armor charge stacks by 1 with each mod equipped. Emergency Reinforcement, which grants a amazing 10% damage resistance when at critical health and consumes 3 stacks of armor charge. Please never use this. Same with Health Font. Listen Blades grants a 30 to 60 extra charge rate for swords, and Clip Projectile Hits grant 20 to 35% increased weapon energy depending on how many you have equipped. Resistant mods grants 15 to 30% damage resistance against PvE enemies based on how many you have equipped. I do not recommend stacking this resist mod multiple times, as it is much better to use multiple mods of different types, as they will stack together and therefore scale better. Then there are unflinching mods that are only useful in PvP and grant 25 to 35% extra flinch resistance whilst ADS based on the amount of mods equipped. On your legs there is Orbs grant ability energy. There are the 1 energy specific mods that grants 10 to 15% grenade/melee energy, whilst the class mod grants 4 to 6% ability energy on orb pickup based on the amount of mods equipped. You also have Orbs of Restoration, that's 2 energy and grants 10 to 15% ability energy to the least charged ability based on the amount equipped, and Absolution that costs 3 energy and grants 5 to 10% energy to all abilities on orb pickup. Then there is Elemental Charge that makes it so picking up an elemental pickup or destroying a tangle progresses a meter that when finished grants 1 armor charge, however it costs 3 energy, which is the same cost as a Surge mod that grants 10 to 22% increased weapon damage when you have armor charge, and the same cost as a Weapons Form mod, and also less expensive than a Stacks on Stacks mod that does the same thing as Charged Up. So use a Surge mod instead of all of those. Then there's Scavenger mods that grant more ammo based on the amount of mods equipped, and Enhanced Athletics that is honestly only really useful in PvP, that grant 30 to 60 mobility stats based on the amount of mods equipped. Lastly, there's holster mods that are basically auto-loading holster and reload your weapon whilst it's not equipped. So, honestly just use 1 scavenger mod and 2 surges unless you're in PvP. Then there's your class item, which is a bit simpler. There's class font, there's a bunch of mods that consume armor charge to do different effects for finishing enemies. The only real relevant one here is Special Finisher, where you consume 3 armor charge to create special ammo on a finisher, and gain armor charge on finisher when you don't have any. There's mods that grant ability energy when you use your class ability. Bomber and Outreach grants 12 to 20% grenade/melee energy based on how many you have equipped, and distribution grants 4 to 7% energy to all abilities based on how many you have equipped. Time dilation makes it so your armor charge takes longer to decay. This is 15 to 20 seconds based on how many you have equipped. Always make sure to use at least one. And finally, Reaper mods. They make a Orb of Light on weapon kill after using a class ability, with more super gains and a lower cooldown based on the amount of mods equipped. So with all that information, I'm now going to give you a couple of examples of how to use it. With PvE first, stat-wise always try to have 70 to 100 weapon stat. This is because of the passive handling and reload speed bonus that will always be useful, and the extra 10 to 15% against all minor and major enemies is very good for killing enemies fast, which is primarily what you need in the world of the portal. Then you just need to figure out what stats you actually need and don't need. For example, say I'm on Hunter with a stasis build on Renewal Grasps. I want basically decent cooldowns for all my abilities here. This is due to the melee being great for general ad clear and slows enemies at distance to generate shards. The super deals pretty decent damage and is actually getting a major 67% damage buff and basically clears rooms on its own. And my main exotic, Renewal Grasps, ideally has high grenade stat in order to loop the Dustfield Grenade and have permanent frost armor. In this scenario, I will basically have to spread out my stats. I will want to get at least 70 class and melee stats so I can have uptime on my melees from Gambler's Dodge, and have 100 grenade stat to loop my Dustfield Grenade. Then, I want a basically minimum of about 70 super stats, and that will usually leave me with some extra stats to place, as we don't really want to get any health stats, as Stasis Hunter DR and Offense is more than enough to deal with basically any survivability issues, alongside the plentiful amounts of perks and abilities that just outright give you more health. This will be true in basically most builds, since the subclass 3.0 system removes any real need to spec into survivability outside of what's immediately available. Therefore, you can either choose to place those stats into a column like super or melee, and give yourself extra ability energy for them, or put them into weapons and grenade stats to get an enhanced damage benefit. It all depends on what you personally feel is the most useful option in this situation. It's worth always remembering as well that you can increase any lower stats value with font mods, as they will basically be active at all times due to how many orbs of lights you will usually generate. If I'm on Warlock, it's a little bit different though. If I'm running a solar buddy build in this example, you'd want to get as much grenade stat as possible. This is because they made it so buddies and turrets scale damage with an enhanced grenade stat. However, you want some class stats so you can have a constant uptime on Hellion, and you want super stats so you can have well up for each damage phase. So, again, we can get 100 weapon stat in this build, because it's just optimal, and then run 70 super and class stats, which can then be later increased with fonts for more uptime, and then dump any and all other stats into your grenade stat, whilst keeping the melee stat at about 30-ish, as the melee isn't as useful as everything else on this build, and we're on solo Warlock, so we don't really need health again. It's all basically just about figuring what you actually need on your build now, and then you can look at what set bonus you want, as these will start getting more interesting when Renegades launches, as there are a bit more build-specific looking set bonuses coming from the look of it. But if you have played the game and currently have armor, you should really just use Bushido and Smoke Jumper for most builds. Default Crown is also a good option, and using both two-piece Kevlar armor sets together works wonders. Then you have your mods. These basically won't change for each build except to cover mods for niche scenarios, or if you're building for a specific activity such as say solo or contest raid instead of making a general use build. Again, sort of just use what you think matches the scenario. But for a baseline, on your helmet you should make sure to almost always have a siphon unless you don't plan to use weapons, at least one ammo finder mod, preferably a heavy finder, as they grant a larger ammo bonus and you will probably end up needing your heavy ammo more, and then either use a second ammo finder or a super font depending on whether you feel you need it or not. On your arms, basically always use a loader mod, always use a ability kill make orbs mod of your main ability, and then a ability damage into energy mod, a font, or dexterity mod if you're doing swaps. On your chest piece, you should always use a ammo gen mod, a resist mod, usually that being concussive dampener, and a charged up mod. If you're doing something like sword damage, try to then fit in 2 loosen blades where you feel you don't need the other mods. On your legs, you should always use a scavenger mod and 2 surges. On your class item, you then want to use special finisher, time dilation, and your pick of class font, reaper, or energy on class ability. In PvP, it is a bit simpler though. Make sure you always have a minimum of 148 health stat, and try to have 100 super stat if you plan to play comp or trials. Then have 68 in each of your stats, but if you're running an optimized tier 5 build, you'll likely end up with at least 80 or 90 in each stat anyway. And do not use the weapon stat in PvP. It is only useful if you're running a 180 hand cannon or a 390 pulse rifle, and that requires I think about 180 weapon stat, which is honestly just not worth it for what will otherwise be 15% reload speed and handling stat that, again, does not go past 100, so it basically will never benefit something like your shotgun. For gear sets in PvP, I heavily recommend the Iron Banner set, as I believe it won't be getting switched out in Renegades, and is just the best overall PvP armor set. But Bushido is also a great option, and less discipline helps out low reload speed weapons such as hand cannons. For mods on your helmets, I've used 2 targeting mods and a in-flight compensator, or 2 in-flight compensators and the 1 targeting mod, depending on whether you're on the MNK or controller. You can also just choose to not use an in-flight compensator for an ammo finder for more special if you don't jump in the air, but you kinda just don't need it in my opinion. Some people also like one of each though. On your arms, I've used 2 dexterity mods or 1 dexterity mod for your lowest handling weapon and a ability kill mix orbs or kickstart mod. Then you can use fastball or ability damage grants energy mod. Kinda just your pick there. On your chest piece, personally I prefer 2 unflinching mods for my primary and a ammo gen mod for more special ammo. However, you could also use 1 unflinching mod for your special and 1 for your primary, but I would always make sure you have at least 1 unflinching mod for your primary weapon at all times. On your legs, scavenger mods basically don't work in PvP, so therefore I would just use a holster mod for your special. Better already, so running over an orb starts your health regen, and then either an orb gives ability energy mod, or a enhanced athletics mod on Hunter, Peacekeeper Titan, or Blink Warlock. So, I think that is basically all of the armor information you need to know. So if you've watched this video, like, comment, sub, the usual stuff, and bye.